This is Craig von Buseck, and I want to talk to you today about the impact of the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Now, when I was in high school, I remember history teachers stating that Ulysses S. Grant was one of the worst presidents in American history. That this was not long after Watergate, and so it was like the worst president was Andrew Johnson, and then Nixon, and then Grant. And someone recently, I was talking to somebody, and they said that their teacher had said to them, they called him Useless S. Grant. Useless S. Grant. Well, this view of our 18th president is not only inaccurate, but it's part of a pro-Southern, pro-Confederate philosophy called the Lost Cause School. Now, having lost the Civil War, a war to defend slavery that devastated the South for several decades, the intellectuals and writers created a narrative that downgraded the man who defeated them, and that was Ulysses S. Grant. This lost cause school sought to downplay Grant's brilliant military strategy that brought the South to its knees. I've heard from many who were taught that Grant was a drunkard, that he was a knuckle dragger who only won the war because he had more resources, and that he was able to defeat the Confederacy because he was a butcher. All of that has been proven to be untrue, by the way, except for the fact that he was most likely an alcoholic. But he was quite dry for most of the war, except for a couple falls off the wagon around the time of Vicksburg. But beyond that, he remained sober for many reasons. But after denigrating his military achievements, the Lost Cause writers went on and took aim at his presidency. And sadly, they were quite successful in getting their views into our schools, our media, and our culture. As I said, when I grew up, Grant was considered to be a poor president. And to this day, there are many who believe that. But it just doesn't jive with the facts. Far from being the second or third worst president, I would say that the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant was one of the most important in American history. Grant served 2 terms as president from 1869 to 1877. He was elected twice by huge margins. He was one of only a handful of presidents in the 19th century that actually served 2 terms. Now, Grant was not an abolitionist growing up. Part of the reason, I think, was that his father was a very strong abolitionist, but he was, Jesse Root Grant was his name, and he was kind of obnoxious. Grant was much more of an introvert and more of a quiet person, and so he may have steered away from his father's abolitionist viewpoints just because he didn't want to be like his father in many ways. But what happened is that when the war broke out and when slavery fired on Fort Sumter, when the Confederacy, which was based on slavery, the vice president of the Confederacy was a man named Alexander Stevenson. Very early in the war, he said that our Confederacy is based on the cornerstone of slavery, and you could not be in the Confederacy unless your state government had within its constitution the protection of slavery. And so Grant said that when slavery fired on the Union, that was the end of it for him. And he realized that slavery was no longer something that could be tolerated in the United States. He was talking years after he left the White House. He took 2 years after he left the White House. For those 2 years, he took a world tour, and he stopped in Germany, among many other countries, and he met with Chancellor Otto von Bismarck. And Grant related their conversation. And Bismarck said to him, "What always seemed so sad to me about your last great war was that you were fighting your own people." Grant responded, "But it had to be done." "Yes," said Bismarck, "you had to save the Union just as we had to save Germany." But then Grant changed and turned the tables a little bit on Bismarck. He said, not only save the Union, but we had to destroy slavery. And Bismarck was a little taken back, and he said, I suppose. However, the Union was the real sentiment, the dominant sentiment. And Grant said, let me explain to you, Chancellor. He said that slavery was the driving force behind the American Civil War. He said this, quote, as soon as slavery fired upon the flag, it was felt, we all felt, even those who did not object to slaves, that slavery must be destroyed. Now, Grant reiterated this position quite forcefully and famously in his personal memoirs. He wrote this as a open attack against the lost cause explanations for the Civil War. Grant wrote, the cause of the Great War of the Rebellion against the United States will have to be attributed to slavery, as opposed to what the Lost Cause School said. Oh, it was about states' rights. It was about the tariff. It was about self-government. Well, only, yes, all those things were true, but only with regard to their protection of slaves. They were fighting for freedom, they said, but the freedom that they were fighting for was the freedom to enslave other human beings. So Grant went on to write in his memoirs, for some years before the war began, it was a trite saying among some politicians that a state half slave and half free cannot exist. All must become slave or all free, or the state will go down. I took no part myself in any such view of the case at the time. But since the war is over, reviewing the whole question, I have come to the conclusion that the saying is quite true. Grant, of course, learned these concepts from his interaction with Abraham Lincoln, who he held in the highest esteem. And it was Grant who, after Lincoln's assassination, took up the mantle, took up the sword and the torch of freedom that was dropped by Lincoln in his assassination. And it was Grant who took up the cause of civil rights for the recently freed slaves after the disastrous presidency of Andrew Jackson. So historians have come to recognize that Ulysses S. Grant was one of the most bold and influential presidents regarding civil rights to ever serve in the White House. He was one of the great civil rights presidents. There have only been a handful, and he was one of those. Grant's presidency was defined by his aggressive use of force by the federal government to protect the rights of the newly freed African American slaves against the violent terrorism of the KKK and other white supremacist groups. He did this through a two-pronged attack. First, President Grant and several key Republican leaders pushed for the establishment of what we now know as the Department of Justice, which was established during Grant's presidency in 1870. Their primary goal was to enforce the Reconstruction laws that protected the civil rights of the recently freed African American slaves. Second, Grant kept the United States Army stationed throughout the South to fight the violent intimidation tactics of the Ku Klux Klan and other white supremacist groups in the South. We need to remember that these terrorist groups, and that's what they were, terrorist groups, their plan was to intimidate not just the former slaves and the black men at that time who were enabled to vote by the Constitution, but also anyone who supported them. And so they would terrorize, they would intimidate, they would injure, and sometimes they would kill. We know about hundreds of lynchings that took place during the years of Jim Crow. It's documented. There's no getting away from this. And sometimes, sadly, there are photos in towns where lynchings of black people were looked on almost in a celebratory mood, like it was a picnic or some sort of a holiday. It was a sick time in our country. And yet there were those like President Grant who were fighting this. And so between the enforcement of the laws that were passed by Congress and signed by President Grant, and then the enforcement of those laws by the federal troops, the Army troops that were stationed throughout the South, during Grant's presidency, the KKK, as it was known, was stamped out. Many people don't understand that. They don't know that part of history. But the KKK was out of business for about 20 years. They came back with a vengeance because there were not civil rights presidents in the White House during the years of Jim Crow, sadly. But during the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant, the KKK was stamped out. So there was key legislation that was passed by the Congress, and that was then signed and enforced by President Grant. So in addition, or some of those enforcement acts were also called the anti-KKK acts or laws, and the Civil Rights Act of 1875. So Congress passed these acts to enforce the 14th and 15th Amendments that gave freedom and equality to the blacks and voting to black men. Of course, we know that women received the vote later in the early part of the 20th century, but at that time, black men were given the right to vote. So let's go through some of these acts that were pushed through by Grant and signed by him as president. So the Enforcement Act of 1870 was also known as the first anti-KKK act. It was meant to enforce the 15th Amendment, making it a federal crime to interfere with a citizen's right to vote by force, bribery, or intimidation. It specifically prohibited disguised persons from conspiring to violate constitutional rights. And this was obviously targeted at the white-hooded KKK. The Second Enforcement Act of February 28, 1871, placed the administration of federal elections under supervision of federal marshals and supervisors, and these were often protected throughout the South by the United States Army. Then there was the KKK Act of 1871, also known as the Third Enforcement Act, and it was considered the most significant anti-Klan law. It was passed after Grant requested authority to combat, quote, systemic and organized depravity in the South. The law authorized the president to use federal troops rather than state militias to enforce the law, and allowed for the suspension of habeas corpus if needed in areas where violence was rampant and the local courts were not giving equal justice to all citizens. It also made conspiring to deny equal protection a federal crime. Grant used these powers to declare martial law in 9 counties in South Carolina in October 1871. This resulted in hundreds of arrests, and it effectively broke the power of the Klan for decades to come. So with the creation of the Department of Justice in June of 1870, Grant empowered then Attorney General Amos T. Ackerman to bring prosecution against KKK members and to uphold these enforcement acts. And then there was the Civil Rights Act of 1875. This last major Reconstruction era act was designed to guarantee equal treatment in public accommodations, public transportation, and to prohibit exclusion from jury service based on race. Does that sound familiar? Well, sadly, that law was overturned by the Supreme Court. And so these protections, this Equal Rights Amendment for all races, was stamped out. And these protections were not there during all of the Jim Crow era of racism throughout the South. And so there was not that freedom. There was the ridiculous concept of separate but equal, which was certainly separate and certainly not equal. And ironically, all of these protections, for the most part, were reenacted in the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which was considered the capstone of the civil rights movement that brought a large measure of equality back to the United States. If only the country would have followed the lead of President Ulysses S. Grant in seeking racial justice, healing, and reconciliation, how different American history might have been. But this is what people during his time thought of him. Forget about the stuff that you've learned perhaps in your schooling or in some of the reading. Look back and see what some of the key leaders of that time said. And who was the greatest African American thinker of that time? It was Frederick Douglass, who supported the presidency and the actions, most of the actions, of Ulysses S. Grant as president. He wrote this, or he said this in a speech not long after President Grant, General Grant, passed away in 1885. He said, "Grant was a man too broad for prejudice, too humane to despise the humblest, too great to be small at any point. In him, the Negro found a protector, the Indian a friend, a vanquished foe a brother, and an imperiled nation a savior." That was Frederick Douglass talking about Ulysses S. Grant. Now listen to this. As Vice President of the United States, Theodore Roosevelt was asked to speak in Galena, Illinois in 1904. Galena had been the home on more than one occasion of Ulysses S. Grant, both before and after the Civil War. I visited both of his homes there in Galena, and I also visited what was the leather goods shop owned by his father, where Grant worked with his two brothers just prior to the Civil War. It was a delightful visit, so I recommend, if you're at all interested in U.S. Grant, to go to Galena and visit these places. But speaking there in 1904, Vice President Theodore Roosevelt said this, as the generations slip away, as the dust of conflict settles, and as through the clearing air we look back with keener wisdom in the nation's past, mightiest among the mighty dead loom the three great figures, Washington, Lincoln, and Grant. There are great men also in the second rank, Roosevelt said, for in any gallery of merely national heroes, Franklin and Hamilton, Jefferson, and Jackson would surely have their place. But these three greatest men, Washington, Lincoln, and Ulysses S. Grant, have taken their place among the great men of all nations, the great men of all time. Pretty good authority, President Theodore Roosevelt, as vice president at that time, but soon to become President Theodore Roosevelt. If you'd like to learn more about Ulysses S. Grant and his impact on America, I've written a book, actually a couple of books about Grant. One is about the last 2 years in his life and his final famous last battle, fighting bankruptcy and incurable throat cancer to make sure that his wife and family were cared for before his death. And that book is called Victor, the Final Battle of Ulysses S. Grant. And then I learned a lot of Grant's leadership principles by writing that book. And so I was asked by my publisher to write a subsequent book. And I called that one Forward, the Leadership Principles of Ulysses S. Grant. You can get those wherever books are sold, and you can learn more about these things on my personal website, vonbuseck.com. Thank you for joining us for this time of looking at the presidency of Ulysses S. Grant. Until next time, this is Craig Von Buseck. Take care.